Gaba is a GDE for Android, currently works as a senior engineering lead at one of the most renowned companies, is probably one of the foremost voices in using Jetpack Compose for Android today, and I'm most fortunate to say he's a good friend of mine. He runs an extremely popular Android developer newsletter called Dispatch, and it's one of the newsletters that I eagerly wait every time I know it's coming out. In one of these recent letters, he interviewed quite a few folks from the Android developer community and asked a simple but really important question. Where do you think Android development will be in 3 years? I sent him my thoughts, and you can read it in his newsletter. I encourage you to. But I thought it would be a lot of fun to ask Vinay what his own thoughts were on the same question, because in my opinion, he is one of the most astute voices in our community, and I was personally very curious. I thought it would be a shame if those don't come out. So I badgered him enough, and he was gracious to give us some time. So without further ado, please welcome Vinay to the show.
Hey, Kaushik. Thank you for having me.
Vinay, before we go, you've been on Fragmented before. You've been kind enough to give us some time in the past, but can you maybe give us a quick description on Jetpack Compose app and Dispatch the newsletter? Because I think it's relatively new. Like, we have about 11 of these letters out, so I'm not sure if everyone knows. Can you give us a little more on that newsletter?
Totally. Quick disclaimer. All the views that I share today, they are my personal views and they do not represent any of my current or past employers. So I started Jetpack Compose app when I started playing with Compose really, which was in 2019 when Compose was still pre-alpha, so not even alpha. And there was no documentation really. So it was all based off of a GitHub project. And there was one talking about what Compose did. And so I got the opportunity to really get involved with the community early on. We had a Slack channel in the Kotlin Lang Slack workspace. And there were about 300-400 people at the time. I think now there are like 15,000 or something. So it's grown quite a bit. But I got the opportunity to see how Compose itself was evolving. And due to the lack of documentation, I figured I should start adding some things I'd observed. So that's how the site started. I launched it in April of 2020 or maybe June of 2020.
Wow. 2020, that's crazy. Yeah.
And I've continued maintaining it ever since. So it's a collection of tools, articles, thoughts on how really to do Compose. And it's reached quite a few people, which I'm very proud about. Also gives me the motivation, right? So when I see people using something I've put out, I don't know, it just excites me, man. I enjoy the fact that I can reach people in like different parts of planet Earth. And in spirit of that, last year I added a newsletter to the site itself. And I called it Dispatch. I just rebranded it slightly differently to make it more catchy, really.
Tell us about that. I'm very curious because initially I was like, wait, why don't you just call it Jetpack Compose's newsletter? I like Dispatch the name, but what was the motivation there?
The motivation for the name specifically was just that I wanted this to be a separate asset almost, so that even if you don't derive any value from Jetpack Compose.app, and I say that because, hey, Google has put out a lot of documentation, right? Not everything that was on the site might be as useful, but I still want to make sure that the newsletter itself is useful. And I can speak to why I'm even doing that. And so I think the main motivation for me was that in my experience, most newsletters, they tend to aggregate links. And I struggle with going through each of them, right? Because I feel like the signal to noise ratio in general, when it comes to Android dev, is very, very low. Even if you tend to spend time on Twitter or Slack or Blue Sky or any of your usual places where you like to hang out. And so as a developer, I want to be told what is actually valuable and relevant for me. If it's entertaining, that would be an added bonus. And I felt that this was a gap. And so with Dispatch, I'm trying to fill that gap. And honestly, it's not even about Android development. I see that as it being about Android developers. Like those are my people. I've done that for the last 15 years, like you. And so we've made a lot of friends. We've continued to be in touch. We go on trips with our friends we've met because we do Android, right? And so I just want to have a way to communicate with them, talk about things that are top of mind for us. Even if 5 years later, we are like, hey, we're transitioning away to something else, I want to play a role in helping everybody transition along with us, right? And so that's how I see it. I think of it as a forcing function for me to write, because I'm already curating a lot of this content for myself. And so this just ends up being, hey, this is very interesting to me. Let me put this together in an email that I share with you. Hopefully you find it funny. Hopefully you find it useful. Hopefully you find it entertaining. And sometimes I'm talking about life, right? Like things that are not even Android related, but they're related to software engineering in general or mental models in general. Over time, I want to start talking about that more and more. And that's Dispatch for you.
I really love Dispatch. And I also know it's a massive effort in its own. I completely understand that aspect of it. So, that's much appreciated. Thank you for the effort. I know a lot goes into it, especially when you're doing like these other very crazy impressive projects on the site. So thank you for that.
I mean, no one understands it better than you, because you really have taught the Android community. We're 280 episodes in at this point. That's no small feat. Like, it takes a lot of motivation to do this for such a long time, and I appreciate all the work you've put in.
You're being extra generous. You don't get to do that on this podcast. So thank you. But you're being extra generous. On to the meat of this show. You interviewed 10 Android developers, asking them specifically where you think Android development would be in 3 years. I have some meta questions before we get to the actual questions themselves.
Totally.
One, what prompted you to ask this question, and why now? Why this question and why now? Why not 5 newsletters back? And, what I'm very curious about what triggered you to ask this question.
I think that's a very, very fair question. And my primary motivation was that software engineering in general is in a very weird spot. It's a time where everything seems possible, and yet you can't really put your finger on what you should be doing. And so I felt that people who've done this for very long, they've gone through a few trends of similar magnitude, and they might have some opinions on how they are positioning their own careers. If you think about when ChatGPT launched, so that was November 30th, 2022, and I know the date because it's my birthday.
Oh, no way.
And so that's when ChatGPT launched. It's been 27 months.
That's crazy to think about it, right? Like, it's not that long, huh?
Exactly. And my day-to-day looks very, very different now as compared to 27 months ago. That is mind-boggling to me. And hence, I felt that 3 years in today's time is a meaningful enough time for things to change. And I wanted to give a perspective on how Android developers should think about this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's funny because I'm also extremely curious. Like, people shouldn't read this and come back 3 years later saying, aha, you were right or wrong. But it's just a snapshot in time.
Totally.
And it'll be, this is the kind of thing where I love a lot of people write about, hey, what I think will happen in the next 10 years and what has happened. I love reading those posts, not because I want to go and fact check the accuracy of it, but it's that moment in time where you feel something, right? And how things took a turn. It like helps prepare you for the future to understand how things might take a turn. I was so, even though you asked me for my response, I was more curious. I was like, hey, can I just get the responses from other people? I'm more interested in listening to that. That was, at least my motivation. I love that idea of like, let's capture this moment in time where clearly, to use a Star Wars reference, there's a disturbance in the software engineering force, right? That the way you articulated that is very true. Everyone is like, wait, what am I supposed to be doing? Nobody understands. The ground is definitely shaking/moving underneath.
Yeah, and you bring up a very good point, which is this is just meant to be a aggregation of the collective wisdom of the crowd, right? So that's one way to look at it. And the other is sometimes you just have to take your bets, and it's better to do something than swirling in circles. My hope was that this gives you one way to think about it. Hopefully you process it and decide to take your bet. It might not be the right one. However, it won't go wasted. It will come back and help you in some shape or form because you put in the effort. At least that's how I view it. Like, I know that no matter what I do today, if I'm putting in genuine effort, it will come in handy at some point of time later on, even though immediately I did not reap its benefits.
Talking about the aggregated wisdom, right? Before we even go in, I'm I highly encourage everyone read this newsletter, right? Like in general, you should subscribe to the newsletter, but specifically this one is very impressive. Even though you're listening to this episode, I think there's so much to gain from reading the predictions from these folks and knowing the context behind it, right? Like just see where they've worked, what they've done in the past. And it was insightful in itself for me to understand, oh, someone who's doing this in this field predicts this. There's so much learning there. So I would encourage you to read every single learning in the context of what each person's prediction is. That's super beneficial. But I want to turn the tables now. I'm very curious. I've been waiting for so long. So I think I'm owed this. I'm owed Vinay's wisdom and his predictions. So you mentioned that there are some opinions that you absolutely agree with and some that you don't, right? Hit us with like the first set of pieces, right? Like, based on where Android development will be in 5 years, what are your predictions? Like what are the ones that you agree with and you feel strongly about?
So as anyone can probably predict themselves, like AI was a big topic in all the responses, and rightly so. Like I think what it's enabled today justifies the amount of attention that it gets. And so a few things that I think I completely agree with were specifically how Android might lag behind the other ecosystems as far as IDE tooling goes. And this was something that Gabriel Peel brought up, who's also an OG in the Android ecosystem.
Happens to work at a semi-important company in this time and age. Yeah.
Totally. Which gives it even more weight. I did not double click on it with him. The way I see it, this is primarily driven by the IDE that is seeing the most attention, which happens to be VS Code and all the forks and the flavors.
Yeah, Cursor AI specifically is that fork that I think most people today, all those vibe coding YouTube videos that you see, they're probably using some version of, that makes sense.
Totally. And I think the other aspect is that as far as LLMs go, they work as well as the data that it used while training. And so when you look at the other ecosystems like React, like Python, they're more mature, which also means that they had more answers about them on Stack Overflow. There were more examples on GitHub that were using those patterns and those snippets. In the case of Android, they have limited data. Compose is fairly new. So our gold standard or preference of how we want to build Android apps tends to have limited information available for LLMs to be trained on. And as a result, I expect there to always be a lag in how well it can write Android code in general, or rather the code that we prefer to write these days.
If I'm an Android developer today wanting to use AI, there seems like there's a bajillion solutions, none of which work perfectly well. And I know perfectly is like maybe a high bar. There's the cursor thing that you can do, which is like the VS Code forks. I actually do use that. And I know you and I have interesting opinions about how that is and where it's going to go. But I do that, but that's not enough clearly because of the Android Studio IntelliJ constraints, right? You need Gradle to work really well with these editors. You need a build system. Then there's, of course, we all use Android Studio, which then has JetBrains. JetBrains has this thing called AI Assist, which is like a plugin that they used. They also have this thing called Junie now, which is more, and it's limited. It's in like a limited waitlist thing. Then there's GitHub's Copilot. There's all these things, but part of me felt, and I was very curious about this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. When Gabe said, it'll lag behind other ecosystems, I actually took it, especially from the IDE tooling perspective, I took it as like there's just, by the time we all collectively just figure out like where to point and shoot, that's what will take us time, while a lot of these other solutions can easily go forward with the existing solutions out there, right? How much of that do you think plays into it versus, because I'm trying to understand, is this slightly more a cultural problem or is this more an actual technical feasibility problem with the existing solutions?
Totally. And I think you bring up a very good point. A lot of software engineering in general is not about the right thing to do. It's about the preferred thing someone wants to do. And that can often be a bad thing. And I do agree that culture has to play a big role here. Preferences have to probably play a big role here. The way I see it, as far as the landscape goes, I see this as a commodity. Like there is nothing that any of the players are doing that are truly groundbreaking. that can't be replicated. And so if it's just a matter of having that functionality available in your IDE of choice, not only does it make sense for the existing players to just make that available for you, I know for a fact that it's top of mind for them. And so I know that the capability will show up in the IDE of choice. And I have a feeling that at least in the short term, we won't have a single IDE to rule them all. Because the lead that they might have in terms of AI specific functionality, it's not large enough that by the time people start considering it, the other IDs will most likely also start exposing those features and functionality. Given the investment, given the amount of people that are focused on that problem, I'm also looking at history, right? And so for the last 15 years, I'm sure there have been other players that have come up with the idea that, hey, we should have a single ID to rule it all, where you can do everything. And we know for a fact that we live in a fragmented world where each platform, whether it's web, iOS, or Android, we choose to have different IDEs. And so I don't know if the features that we're talking about today, as it currently stands, is enough for us to overcome that preference. And I mean, there is a very high chance that I end up being wrong about it, which is totally fine, but that's where my thoughts were, at least.
I like what you also prefaced initially, right? Which is, look, you can make a prediction, but let's see what happens, right? Because the things are changing so rapidly. So that makes sense.
You need one release and everything changes, right? Like, and that's what ended up happening with Chat GPT, which opened the floodgates, Rolly. I can talk about one more thing that you mentioned, which I thought was very interesting. And I encourage you all to read it, only for Kaushik's answer, if not for anybody else. But Kaushik did mention about how Pixels and other Android OEMs will start gaining traction, and the quality of hardware will start focusing on AI capabilities, which indirectly is basically saying that we'll have better hardware so that on-device models can support AI capabilities. I completely agree with this. AI features are going to be the top keynote highlights whenever these new phones are being launched. The bar for the hardware itself that the OEMs are focused on, I suspect, will be on the more premium side in order to be able to support these capabilities. I almost imagine every single one of us having a private sidekick that knows everything about us, that can answer questions without me repeatedly adding things to the context, which is what we do today. This, in my head, is inevitable. Like, there is no way that I don't need privacy. And hence, the on device story, in my opinion, is very, very important. Because if you just reflect on the last 27 months, think about all the intimate information you're sharing with something like ChatGPT. I never asked those questions to Google, right? And I had 15 years to ask them the questions, 20 years to ask them the questions, and I never did. It affords me to ask the kind of questions that you never put in a search box. And due to the sensitive nature of that, I want to feel secure and I want it to not leave my device at all. And so these on device AI models are going to make a big dent in determining the kind of hardware that the OEM start producing. And I think that this will force the Android ecosystem to start focusing on the more premium side. And I think the lower end models will, the lower end phones will not be as prevalent as they've historically been in the past, which means that Android developers will start having the ability to get away with a bit more.
So I'd love to hear more of the other predictions that came along.
Another big theme was around our role as Android engineers itself. And a recurring theme that I saw in a lot of these responses was around us having the ability to spend more time thinking about what to build rather than how to build it.
Spend more time on what to build more than how to build. And I feel this is something that plagues the Android community. We've always, what's the word? we love to spend as much time talking about the specifics about like API implementations and architecture patterns, and maybe not as much on what the product is. This is like a big thesis for me too, right? I feel like the indie development side of Android hasn't caught up because I feel a lot of the people who are empowered to make these changes, the Android developers, spend a lot of time on the minutia, right? Some of it is historical, which is, yeah, we didn't have the platform necessary to enable that kind of quick iteration like maybe our iOS counterparts did. But I think a lot of those holes are like for the most part plugged now, that there isn't an excuse anymore. And I'm being a little more harsh with my words, but that isn't an excuse anymore. Like we should have high quality Android apps, especially from the third party developers and the indie developer community, that you just have to open up on the iOS side. And some of the best apps on iOS are actually third party apps, not the ones that come from Apple, right? But that's not true with Android. With Android, like if you do have to look at some of the best apps, unless it's an exception, many of them are what Google themselves have written. And that's such a, I feel it is that is the symptom. The root cause is that we've not spent the time focusing on the product aspects of it. And I like, that's why I liked how you phrased it, which is like, we have to spend more time on the what, not the how.
By the way, this was Gabe saying that in one of his responses, but I totally agree with that perspective. And I have even more thoughts based on what you just said, which I completely agree with, which is for some reason, we are not focused on the business of apps. And I've mentioned this in passing on Twitter in the past, which is there are a lot more web and iOS indie developers that can sustain themselves doing what they love, which is building apps, as compared to Android. And I think that's just unfortunate. I feel that we can do a better job in having an ecosystem where we are focused on the business side of apps or the business side of products really in general, because it's something I'm applying to myself. Like as I think about longer term, what do I want to be known for? Android is a medium or one way of building products. It's not the only one. And I wish you could go a lot further just sticking to it. And more importantly, you need role models that have done it for people to have a lot more optimism that it's possible, because we don't have sufficient role models. People do not take the shot. And I think we are worse off as a result.
How much do you think some of that is cultural? Because, the common retort there is, yeah, but, Android developers, actually, no, not Android developers. Android in general as an ecosystem promotes the free stuff, open source. Like, most of the great indie apps, the natural questions like, oh, have you open sourced this? Can I take a look at it? Can I install it on my device? How much of that is that problem? And do you think, because a lot of that is historical. That's what allowed Android to sort of gain the traction that it has today. Do you think that there is a way to turn that around, or?
I don't know if there's a way to turn it around. I'm certainly optimistic that that is going to be the case. However, you brought up something very interesting, which was like we're used to getting a lot of things for free. And that is the beauty of Android too, right? Like the reason I was able to become an Android developer, or the reason I was forced to become an Android developer, was because I didn't have a MacBook, nor could I afford one, right? And so the fact that I could use whatever hardware I had to start building apps and honestly change my life since I made that decision is what makes Android beautiful, right? And which is why I've been so passionate for so long, and a lot of people will relate to that sentiment. But also, we start expecting that in all aspects in general, and hence the ecosystem remains small or smaller relative. I know there are people who are probably crushing it as well. We just don't see them in the open. And I wish, like, if you're a listener and you are sustaining yourself doing it, I would encourage you to come talk about it openly, like we see a lot of other people do on the internet, because I think it ends up causing a ripple effect that you might not realize.
The question you're asking is how many Android indie developers are able to make a living just being an indie developer, right? And I mean, that's been hard even on the iOS side recently, is what I've heard. But at least there's a clear story there, right? And we don't have that story even now. And you're right. Part of how we change that is talk more about those aspects. Like, who are the successful folks who are able to pull this off? Use them as role models, so to speak. I love that idea. Tell me more about how you, some of the other predictions. There were also some on just hiring and employment, which again is top of mind. If you ask any engineer today about AI, like I'm sure part of like the thing that makes everyone's stomach churn is that like, hey, as software engineers, your value is being brought down a lot, right? If I'm being really raw about it.
Yeah, I think some people did talk about what it means for software engineers or like new engineers that are trying to enter the field. And I think the reality for especially people who are still like junior or new grad, I'm conflicted about it. Like on one side, I know that it can be very hard to break into the field where AI is being positioned as a junior engineer, right? Like that's the bar that we view it as. And so there's a lot of optimism that over time, we know for a fact that models will continue to improve. That's a very, very safe assumption to make, at least for the next few years. And if we make that assumption, we can see a clear path, essentially it being able to do the work that a lot of engineers can do. We have to anticipate it and plan for it. I think the counterpoint to that bleak view almost for software engineering is that anytime something is brand new, you have a very small window to be the expert. Because the LLM experts today, they have 2 years of experience, 3 years of experience. You have the ability to stand out relative to the people who've been in the field for 15 years. And in a lot of cases, exceed what they can do. And so if I was in their shoes, that's the optimistic view I would have instead of being pessimistic about it, that let me go all in, focus on this new technology that everyone's trying to figure out. The bar to stand out is very, very low. And I think this was true even for something like Compose, right? Like early days of Compose, the bar was lower to have your project stand out because nothing existed. So anything that you're doing adds value. And that in turn ends up helping your careers in general. And I think the same thing applies here as well. I wouldn't be too pessimistic. I'd just figure out a way to be a part of the wave, right? Like when you're seeing a wave, like you have to make a call on whether you're excited about it and whether you want to ride it or not. And if you seem to be excited and want to ride it, the goal is to simply uh, put a paper boat in, right? Like figure out what your paper boat is. Doesn't have to be a ship, right? Like rising tide takes all. That includes your paper boat too. That includes the floaty you're trying to throw in as well. Uh, that's how I see it. We have enough signal to know that this is an interesting field to focus on. And it does not mean that you throw away everything you already know. The way I see it, your life is a set of Venn diagrams or a set of circles, each circle representing a skill. And you're adding new circles to your life essentially. And it doesn't mean that if I'm focused on AI these days, that I don't do or care about mobile or Android. I'm just adding a new circle so that there's a new intersection in my life's Venn diagram.
Dude, you have so much wisdom. Like you should probably start another newsletter. One newsletter is not enough.
I mean, it's stuff that I'm reading myself, right? Like,
right.
And I don't mean to be preachy at all.
No, it's not. I don't think. Yeah, I'm not feeling this.
And I know it might come across that way. Like that's not the intention. Like I'm just trying to create mental models for myself so that my decision making becomes easier. Because if that isn't easy, then I end up doing analysis paralysis. And I'm inclined to say that I operate better when I know what I'm going after. I did mention something which is choosing when to ride the wave. Related to mental models, I was actually writing something on the topic. And the title of that post was going to be ride the wave if your grandma says so.
I love it. I love it.
And so I want to double click on that a bit. So there's been a few waves since the 2000s that I've had the opportunity to participate on. The wave that I ended up choosing previously was the mobile wave. Fantastic decision in retrospect. Changed my life. I know it changed your life. It changed the lives of millions of people. But even after doing that, like there have been more opportunities where I could have shifted focus, right? Like could have cared about crypto. I could have focused on something like AR, VR, and I didn't. And the reason I didn't choose to spend time there was because my observation there was the internet existed. I had grandparents. Even then, it wasn't sufficient for them to be interested to embrace the internet. They really started embracing it when things like WhatsApp came about, which essentially is the mobile wave, right? And that's when they started embracing these new technologies that previously they just did not care to do, right? Like we had a computer in our house, and yet it wasn't sufficient for them to really understand what a computer is. That changed with mobile. And so to simplify my life, I like to take into account how large of an opportunity it is and whether it will impact my grandparents. When I think about something like AR, VR, I don't think my grandparents will care about it. When I think about AI, I'm convinced they will care about it. I'm convinced that they will be using voice mode and asking questions in their own language because they don't even need to learn how to type anymore. It is a no brainer in my head that this is a wave that is worth paying attention to as compared to anything else that came before this wave and after the mobile wave. Hence, a lot of my time is being spent on it because I have this very simple mental model in my head that lets me make decisions. So it's about systemizing your life, which I know you are a big fan of, and you've spoken about it multiple times in the past in your writing, in your podcast itself. So I'm curious on what you think about this decision making framework that is honestly lame if you think about it, but helps me simplify my thinking.
I agree with the idea of having those systems. What will make it tricky is that doesn't mean everyone listening adopts, your approach now, which is,
Totally.
right, like, right the way grandma says. So it's a no-brainer. And I think more often than not, you're going to be successful. But you can get into decision paralysis. I like how you started the entire episode saying, look, it's better to do something than nothing. And in many ways, like, have a model that makes sense to your values and simplify some of those decisions. Don't get caught in swirling in that paralysis of whether I should do something, whether I shouldn't do something. Should I stick to building my regular Android apps and then just put blinders on and not worry about what's going on? In one of the predictions that, you asked, I said something very similar, right? I think mobile is still king. It's going to be the conduit that most people use. Even if AI is going to become the next wave, I still strongly believe that mobile is going to be that conduit.
Totally. And this is not to say that you can't be successful focusing on other things. Not at all. I think this is just a mental model I have for myself when figuring out what I should be spending time on. Because I'm looking at the opportunity size in general, and I'm looking at, hey, can I be doing this for the next 10 years? And more importantly, is this interesting to me? And I think the last part is probably the most important, because if it's not interesting to me, I'm not going to be enjoying it, right? Like if I'm just doing it for the sake of it, I will end up having a hard time. And so throw away all this advice, throw away all of it if you know what you like and you enjoy it genuinely.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So, we've been talking a lot about like some of the predictions that you agreed with, and a lot of this seems to be in sync with how your own mental model works. Were there any opinions that came out that you actually disagree with? Like, what are some things where you're like, I don't know, because it's nice to make things spicy, right? You don't always have to agree about everything. Yeah, what was something where you just felt didn't align with your headspace?
I did see a lot of multi-platform, like Kotlin and Compose multi-platform being mentioned in the answers.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've come a long way. It does a reasonable job working. It does the job. I am not as thrilled about that in general because I've been burnt by cross-platform. Uh,
We've called wolf too many times on that one.
exactly, and I think that's a really good way to put it. I'm not pessimistic necessarily. It's just that it's not getting a lot of my attention. Uh, I remain very optimistic that it will continue to play a role. I think a lot of people will embrace it. But I think it ties back to the point that you made earlier about culture, and preferences have an outsized impact on the tools that we choose to use. We forget about whether it's adding business value or not and get caught up in whether we like it or not. And more importantly, for anything cross platform to really work out, all sides of the equation need to be thrilled about it, as opposed to it being a one sided proposal, which is almost always the case everywhere, where people who are already comfortable with Kotlin or Compose are like, hey, we should do it for the other side too. And then it's a negotiation process, as opposed to, hey, both of us are thrilled. It's just a matter of going ahead and doing it. And I've not seen the latter as much as the former in general. I'm talking about the industry in general. I think that's the piece that holds us back. That's the piece that will cause us to spend time on my perspective versus your perspective. And hence I'm not as optimistic because it's not the best use of our time.
Like I said, very astute. I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, very direct. I realize that I'm being like very, very direct, but I do think that
No, this is great. Like we should have different opinions.
yeah, it requires thought certainly, and I'm still forming opinions. And by the way, it's possible that 6 months later I completely change my mind, which is fine. It doesn't make me a hypocrite. It makes me someone that is processing new information and making new decisions.
Strong opinions loosely held, right? That's the idea.
Love that.
What are some other things that you thought were maybe not sort of, aligned?
Yeah, I think one thing that I remember reading about was reading that the difference between mediocre apps and great apps isn't going to be solved by AI. I totally understand what they're trying to say. I think where I differ is that a lot of the decision making to make a great app, they are solved problems that 10,000 companies in an 8 by 8 mile city called San Francisco are solving 10,000 times. Right. And so there is something to be said about you can make a great app by just following that advice that's already on the internet. And you now have a way to get access to exactly that advice without having to navigate like 20 different journeys. And the assumption I'm making is that models will continue to get better. And I feel very confident in believing that that will be the case for a few more years at least. And so I do think that you can leverage AI to still make great apps because some of your growth tactics that you need to employ, some of your payment tactics, your prompts or your upsells, all of those minor things that developers actually haven't focused on because they were not focused on the business aspects of the app. You now have a partner to make that decision with you because you can ask and get the appropriate responses and then take its help to even build that functionality. So I believe that you can get very far taking that journey from a mediocre app to a great app. And that's where I have the opposing view that I do believe that you can go from mediocre to great using AI.
Are there any opinions you thought that were not covered by anyone that you would like to put out there to our listeners in the world? Like, what are some things that you just in general feel that may not have been touched by anyone?
So I'll run through them quickly because these are things that weren't necessarily covered, but I believe that we'll encounter them. And again, these are my personal views. I think over the next few years, we'll hear about a catastrophic error that was introduced due to wipe coding. in the short term, and like it'll be an incident in some product, some company, because an auto-generated code snippet was accepted and we didn't pay attention to it enough and it ended up breaking something. This is the other side of AI. As optimistic as I am about it, it still needs some attention. I don't think we can ignore that. I don't know what shape or form it will take, if it will even be announced in the public that that's what causes it. Uh, but it's inevitable. Like I see that happening somewhere at least. I think the next view that I have is that interviewing will probably need to look a bit different. And I'm not sure about what shape that takes, but I've seen a lot of tools and open source projects being created that helps you do the interviews. I don't think it's sustainable for companies. And so eventually we'll start seeing some innovation here. I don't know what shape it takes, but everyone will probably start paying some more attention over the next 3 years. Moving on, I think there's a big chance that Stack Overflow might not even exist, which is wild to think about, but they've experienced like a significant drop in traffic. People don't need to go to Stack Overflow as much as they used to. I don't think this is for the better, because it was a very strong repository of data that makes our AI systems better. But if people aren't going to it, they will contribute less to it. And as a result, we are worse off if Stack Overflow didn't exist. Even if it does exist, which honestly is probably going to be the case, it's just not going to be as prevalent as it was when we were climbing our own careers as software engineers, where there wasn't a day where I didn't reference Stack Overflow.
The difference is like, people say, oh, but isn't that the same point about Google? But I think it's subtly different because Google does collect data and, they're able to provide that signal through other means, and Stack Overflow maybe not. No, that makes sense. I think, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
All right. Another one that I had on my list here was the need for basic apps will significantly reduce. And the bar for even launching an app will have to be a lot higher. And that's because of generative UI. And that's because a lot of these products already give you the ability to spin up a local app that you can run. And I'm exaggerating a bit, right? Like I'm certainly exaggerating. Like those apps don't retain state. You can't use it on a daily basis. All that is fine. But a bulk of downloads that we see in apps are apps that I just need once, right? Like I have a very specific use case today that I might not have for the next 4 months again. And those very basic, simple apps, you will be able to get on the fly. We've seen products like Replit allow you to like type what you want and it generates a live app for you that you can even publish to the App Store, by the way.
It's crazy. It's scary, but yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Totally. And as a result, I think that the low-hanging fruit for what an app could be would be much higher than it has been in the past. That might not be a bad thing because it means that the app stores will start having better quality apps in general. And that has been a challenge for the app stores as well, because they've regularly pruned a lot of apps over the years. And so this might take a natural course where people are forced to ship higher quality apps. So it might be a good thing. I don't know. I think one more thing that I can maybe cover is that the way we ramp up on, actually two more things. So the first one is the way we ramp up on projects will become a lot faster because we'll have more tools to help us ramp up.
100%. And by the way, this is one of those things I feel we don't touch on. You'll see a lot of these YouTube videos about how you use AI for coding. All of it is the code generation piece, right?
Exactly.
I don't think we see as much about how, and I personally feel that's been so much more valuable to me. Ramping up on new code is definitely easier. I feel that too, right? And this is even if I see someone sending in a huge PR over and I'm like, oh God, wait, to even first form the mental model around what each piece is before I can start to give, feedback. I feel AI helps a lot with that. It's just able to condense it and then you're like, okay, wait, I got the mental pieces. Now let's go in with this idea. I don't know if that piece has been exercised as much yet.
Totally. Yeah, it's not been a part of a broader conversation as much as some of the other things, but you're spot on about that. I think the second order impact of this is that I predict that full stack engineering will play a much bigger role going forward, because the expectation will be that engineers are able to do more with less. And because we'll have tools available to ramp up, the barriers to entry to contribute to these other platforms, um, like you'll just be better positioned to be able to do that.
Vinay, this has all been like a gold mine of advice. You've given me enough to think about it, and I need to come back and process some of like these nuggets. What's some parting wisdom before we wind this episode down? What do you want to leave our listeners with at the end of this episode?
I did not have a lot of closing thoughts. You mentioned something that, so I'm a big fan of quotes, and it's very, very cheesy, right? Like quotes in general are cheesy, but I don't know why I somehow get motivated when I see some of these quotes. It's just a weird connection in my head that I think about them. And so one of the quotes that were related to two words you said right now that I really absolutely love is, "Pessimists avoid risk, optimists change the world." I quite like this quote because it signifies how I feel about the current trend. I am very optimistic. I don't take that lightly because I didn't react to the previous waves, and we touched on it during this conversation. And so it feels like a thoughtful decision on my part to be optimistic about this one in particular. There will be a lot of noise, and I think our job as people who've been in the field for a bit is to make sure that we can get our signal to noise ratio to be as high as possible. And that is my focus, right? Like I don't want to be distracted by everything, but once I have conviction, I want to go after it. And so that's what I'm applying for myself. I don't think it's advice necessarily, but if it resonates with anyone, please reach out. I'd love to chat.
Pessimists avoid risk, optimists change the world. Can't close with a better note. Vinay, thank you so much for chatting with our listeners. Thank you for putting in all the effort in coming up with Dispatch. It is truly one of my favorite newsletters, especially in this world where social media is all over the place. There's multiple channels. I look forward to that email that comes out. Thank you so much.
It's really kind of you to say that. Genuinely grateful that I got the opportunity to come here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.